Jeffrey Sachs, welcome to the JFK Facts podcast. This is such a treat. Um,
Well, for me too. Thank
I,
you.
I'm
I'm very pleased to be with you.
so I know that the JFK Facts podcast, you think we're going to talk about JFK, but I want to start far away from that and work our way towards it. Um, just because I think what you bring to the story is so interesting, and I don't know if my viewers, my readers know who you are. So I just want to talk a little bit about your career as an economist and my own experience. I remember when I first heard your name, I associated you with the phrase shock therapy
Mhm.
in Peru, Poland, and Russia. And then over time, which I thought of as a kind of libertarian, inegalitarian economics. And then over time, I see you sustainable development goals, UN, and your economics seem very egalitarian. Is there a change in your career or over those 30 years that you've been in public life?
No, just depends on the problems one works on. If you were trying to end a hyperinflation, you do certain things.
Uh-huh.
If you are trying to end poverty, you do other things.
Uh-huh.
So it's really. I first came to public light in the mid 1980s,
Right.
working on a series of high inflations in Latin America and Eastern Europe. I trained in monetary and financial economics and was actually not bad at ending hyperinflations. And
Uh-huh.
so that was the beginning of my career. When you end a hyperinflation, you do not go from 20,000% inflation to 10,000% the next year to 5,000% the year after to 1,000% the year after. You go from 20,000% to no inflation within a week, actually.
Uh-huh.
It's quite amazing. And that's where the phrase shock therapy appropriately applies.
Mhm.
Almost every other use of it is incorrect.
Uh-huh.
But when I worked in the Bolivian hyperinflation in 1985, the inflation rate was running at about 24,000% uh, per year, year over year, from mid 1984 to mid 1985, something around 60% per month inflation. And it stopped in August 1985. So that was a sudden stop. I told them at the time, by the way, that if everything works, if you have great experience, you will convert Bolivia from a impoverished country and social strife with hyperinflation to an impoverished country without hyperinflation. In other words, inflation doesn't end your poverty, it just enables you to start a process of building.
Mhm. And so outside of the context of ending hyperinflation, you would say your economics have always been egalitarian.
Well, my economics were very much molded in the milieu of Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the 1970s.
Uh-huh.
That was a Cambridge uh, in which Paul Samuelson and John Kenneth Galbraith loomed large.
Right.
Paul Samuelson was a brilliant, mostly theorist
Uh-huh.
who had the idea of a mixed economy. He studied the fact that certain things could be left to the market, certain things could be uh, required, actually, the state. Um, and he made the formal theory of public goods. He explained already back in the 1940s and 50s why do certain things fit the marketplace and other things absolutely need government. And he created a kind of synthesis, and it followed also the work of John Maynard Keynes
Hmm.
in Britain in the Depression era of the 1930s. So John Kenneth Galbraith was to uh, Samuelson's left.
Uh-huh.
He was definitely America's leading progressive economist of the age. And he basically also had the idea of public goods as being crucial. Uh, he wrote the book The Affluent Society in 1957, and the theme was, why is our private life affluent but our public life impoverished? Why are our public areas broken down? And he said, because government isn't allowed to do and isn't empowered to do what it should be doing. So these were not libertarians. These were definitely the mixed society, and they would be called New Deal Democrats or New Frontier Democrats of the 1960s. That was the milieu in which I was raised, and that was the philosophy that I believed in. Uh, in 1976 and 1977, I spent two visits to Sweden, which was even to the left of that as a Scandinavian social democracy. And I pretty much imbibed that idea of social democracy as the right form of government. It's funny that you raise a question that, of course, I've heard for 35 years. Oh, I thought you were a libertarian. And the difference is if you're dealing with a hyperinflation or a collapsed central planning system, uh, the things you recommend are a little bit different from the issues facing the United States, for example, right now.
Right, right,
And so you naturally emphasize certain things like starting from complete central planning, you emphasize markets for
right,
sure, because that was the missing part.
right.
If you are in a more libertarian environment like the United States, or pseudo-libertarian, I would say, you emphasize the role of responsible government. So
Mhm.
it all depends on uh, where you are facing the challenge and what exactly you're trying to do.
So, yeah, so in recent years, you're really identified with sustainable development goals, ending poverty. Um, how's that going in the big picture in, say, the last 20 years?
In the big picture, uh, extreme poverty has come down substantially in the world because basic economic development works and because certain places like China have done extraordinarily well in mobilizing technology, mobilizing public investment, public education, building infrastructure to enable the empowerment of people to live better lives.
Hmm.
China was a country that had about 80% extreme poverty back in 1980 and essentially none today. And while China is often attacked and criticized in the Western media, the fact of the matter is it's probably done better than any other country in the whole world in getting rid of its extreme poverty. And so, on the whole, if you look at the global averages, because of China's progress, because of India's very strong progress, because of rapid economic development in Southeast Asia, and in some other parts of the world, there is progress, substantial progress in ending extreme poverty. If you look at the environmental side, things are much less good news at this point because uh, ending poverty, you can use more or less traditional technologies, which are polluting. But if you want to uh, address the environmental crisis, that requires an overhaul of technology. It requires moving from fossil fuels to various kinds of renewable energy and other zero carbon energy technologies. And technology change at an organized global level is an unprecedented challenge, and we're not good at meeting it. You
Yeah.
look at the United States, the U.S., under Trump has walked away from the climate issue. He claims it's not important or it's not real or whatever. This is, of course, tragic and absurd, and but it is a reflection of actual politics.
Yeah. So you talk about this tremendous gains globally in poverty, but in the United States, not much has changed 20 years in terms of, or has it?
Oh, so, I'm talking about extreme poverty. Extreme
Yes.
poverty is poverty that kills, poverty that, I mean, kills by the day,
Right.
hunger, lack of access to safe drinking water and sanitation, and so on. America has a more insidious kind of poverty that is insidious in the sense that it's not people starving to death in general, but it is people suffering from a uh, almost a banishment from the mainstream of society, living in very uh, decrepit conditions or homeless people, people who have enough calories per day but not a healthy diet,
Right.
people who can get emergency medicine or health care but not routine health
Right.
care. So it's not the same kind of poverty, but it does kill, but it kills more gradually.
Mhm.
And it takes years off of life expectancy, but it doesn't take decades off of life expectancy.
Right.
So progress on that, it's debated. I would say it has been completely insufficient because we are a super wealthy nation with a lot of poor people.
Mhm.
Uh, not in extreme poverty, but in enough poverty to create a lot of suffering. And that's a disgrace of our country and of our political system.
Yeah. So, which brings us to Trump, whole new approach to geopolitics and international economics. What do you see in terms of alleviating poverty from this administration in the next
N Nothing.
nothing?
There's no interest in it at all.
Yeah.
No discussion. When it comes to the international side, basically, they canceled most everything that was being done in that area. Part of what they canceled was pretty awful. USAID was not my favorite organization
Yeah, I was going to
because
ask you about that.
yeah,
What will be the impact of that?
well, USAID was two things in one.
Right.
Partly it was true help for poor people, say providing life-saving medicines.
Right.
And the other is it was a foreign policy arm of the United States, often engaged in even supporting regime change operations, color revolutions, propaganda abroad, and so forth. I have no taste for the latter. I
Uh-huh.
have big support for the former. In fact, I helped design some of those programs. So USAID messed up by combining the two. It became a political arm of U.S. foreign policy, which it should not have been. It should have been an institution devoted to helping end poverty. It should have been a sustainable development arm, not a political arm. I think it was very badly mismanaged over the years, and it left itself vulnerable. And like almost everything else Trump did, it was done extraordinarily crudely. Instead of taking a scalpel, they took a hatchet and they just killed the organization rather than trying to save the good parts and discard the bad parts.
How much of AID would you define as the good part? If somebody were doing it right, what would they have done?
I don't know quantitatively on the inside, but rather half and half.
Yeah.
AID was highly politicized in an inappropriate way,
Yeah, and I
and
think,
it definitely tarnished the other part of USAID.
well, I also think that it meant that the politicization deprived it of defenders. That people felt if they didn't buy into the politics, why should they buy into the humanitarian?
Well, I agree with that. That's how I feel, for example.
Yeah.
I didn't stand up and cheer for USAID, even though I've devoted my life to the good side of it because I thought it was really a deeply damaged institution.
Yeah. So to continue on the Trump front, that's kind of economics and foreign aid. In the geopolitics, we seem to have moved from alliances to complete transactionality, I guess. And uh, was that, I'm trying to think of how to phrase the question. I mean, was that inevitable that just this empire structure that was set up after World War II just couldn't sustain itself? Because it seems to me like, part of the reason Trump could do all this was that these structures didn't seem to serve people. It didn't, you know.
I agree with that, although the basic point that you raise is right, that American governance uh, changed a republic to an empire, pretty much as happened in Rome in the first century BC and AD, and what were the trappings of republicanism, not in the political party, but in the type of government, and that is the Congress, for example, became weaker and weaker relative to an imperial uh, leader. And just like Rome went to an emperor, we went to a president who rules by decree.
Mhm.
So this is the result of many things, the corruption of our political system by money and interest groups, but also the imperial state, which was created after World War II, especially starting in 1947 with the creation of Central Intelligence Agency, which
Yeah.
created a kind of private army for the president. So this, to my mind, is the failing, but which way the failing would manifest is very accidental. We
Uh-huh.
didn't have to fall into Trumpism. We could have devolved into many other ways.
Right.
A leader could have said, you know, we're really in a multipolar world, so we should bolster the UN.
Mhm.
Trump says, well, we should break apart the UN because he's not isolationist at all, and it's not only transactionalist. It is uh, his disdain for any kind of treaties or rules.
Yeah.
The idea is the U.S. should act on its own. Sovereigntist is the term that's used now. You know, we
Mhm.
need maximum sovereignty, maximum freedom of action. Well, that is one interpretation of how to address the changing world. It's not mine.
Yeah.
Mine is because the world's very dangerous, we should go towards international rules. But that's pretty much the opposite of what he's trying to do.
Yeah. So, in the last, I think of the last, since World War II, we haven't really had a president who's steered away from empire, right? I mean, every president has pretty much embraced it, right? Which
I
brings
would say, except JFK in 1963.
which brings us to our topic. Yeah. So
Yes,
is 1963 a turning point in American governance and empire?
it almost was.
Mhm.
Uh, you know, I think the whole story of John F. Kennedy is a very moving, very deep story.
Yeah.
Um, I probably our greatest president I think our greatest president in history, I would say by far is Franklin Roosevelt, but I would say JFK comes second in the 20th century. Um, but his life was cut short uh, as he was attempting a fundamental change of foreign policy. And what I find remarkable about Kennedy and the arc of his presidency is that he came into office actually, though very young, also quite aware and quite experienced because uh, as the son of uh, a leading official of the New Deal, ambassador to Britain. He had been shown the world,
Hmm.
wrote his senior thesis at Harvard on the origins of World War II, why England slept. Kennedy saw war action, of course, in the Pacific. He toured the world as a congressman and senator. He was very much aware of the changing world, very much aware of the independence movements uh, that were ending European colonialism and imperialism. He was an anti-imperialist himself. He was, of course, very, uh, very much affected by Barbara Tuchman's Guns of August and the experience of World War I and World War II, how easy it is for the world to fall into disaster. So he came into office determined to make peace, actually. He was a cold warrior, but determined to make peace. And he almost stumbled into the end of the world. And some were his mistakes, and some were his counterparts' mistakes, and some were accidents that happen that can end the world in the nuclear age. But I find poignant and shocking that such an intelligent and well motivated leader as Kennedy almost presided over the end of the world in October 1962.
Yeah.
And I think that absolutely also shook him and changed him to the core. And I find the period from the Cuban Missile Crisis till the end of his life to be almost a miraculous period of global statesmanship of the very highest order. Um, and so I think it was a period that would have transformed America and transformed the world. And I think that's why he was killed. So I think it all is part of this story that we're trying to unravel.
So Kennedy in 63, you see as a, because there is this conventional interpretation. He's really just a cold warrior. He was, he would have been very much like Johnson in Vietnam. Um, I don't see it that way.
Oh, I think all the evidence is to the
Yeah,
contrary, by
yeah,
the way.
yeah.
I think he was so shaken by what happened. And everything I know about him from everything that I've thought and read and seen and studied and discussed was that he was not only shaken by how close the world came to an end and by the fact that his advisors failed him terribly
Yeah.
on the occasion. They were as bad can be, almost to a person. Uh, but he also had this very tragic sense for a lot of reasons, his personal life uh, and his sensibility and personality. He had this sense of the fragility of life on the planet, and his own life, of course, because of his health throughout his life. He was, in my opinion, profoundly moved by what happened in October. And there are many, many anecdotes that confirm this, how he would look into the rain and look out the window of the White House and realize the fragility of it all, or realize that radioactive particles were being carried by the rain because of the atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons. He was a very deep and a very sensitive person, in my view. And uh, in 1963, everything I know about his life in that year tells me that he wanted to pull the world back from the brink of nuclear Armageddon. And that was his life's mission, and he succeeded until they got him.
You talk about the events of 1963, and you talk about this as an extraordinary time of statesmanship. What else what else does he do in 1963 that you see as markers of this turn of his? You have
Well,
that.
the main thing on the foreign policy side was, of course, the negotiation of the partial nuclear test ban treaty.
Right.
he decided after October 1962 two things. One, the world had to be pulled back from the brink. And second, he actually had a kind of deep empathy with Khrushchev, of all things, because I think he realized in the Cuban Missile Crisis and afterwards that Khrushchev was facing the same situation that Kennedy faced, a bunch of warmongering advisors around,
Yeah.
and two people that had the fate of the world in their hands. And so, on a foreign policy side, this was the first thing that he realized he wanted to pull back from the brink, that he would do that through a long discussed but never consummated partial nuclear test ban treaty or nuclear test ban treaty. It became partial because of the limits on monitorability that precluded at the time or felt to be precluded a ban on underground nuclear tests.
Mhm.
But in any event, that was one thing. Second, he knew from Laos and from Vietnam and from his own experiences in Asia, he did not want to get trapped in an Asian land war. I think his whole career he made that clear. And yet he was slipping into it.
Yeah.
And in 1963, he told many, many people that he was not going to allow that to happen. Being the politician that he was, he said he was not going to allow that to happen after the 1964 elections. And But he took steps already in 1963 to start a drawdown from Vietnam. And that was real. It was known. It's not a myth. It's not a hypothesis. It's
Right.
absolutely well understood. On the domestic side, this was the explosion of the civil rights era. And Kennedy had not really come into the presidency much committed to this, much
Yeah.
aware of it. Uh, Even his own experience of poverty was pretty limited, having grown up in one of America's richest households
Yeah.
and living a very high life indeed. But his experience in the campaign in West Virginia was an eye opener for him. Uh, and the campaigns were an eye opener for all the Kennedy brothers. So they learned a lot by seeing, and they had tremendous empathy, really remarkable empathy, all of them. But in any event, the civil rights movement ran ahead of him and the political agenda. It annoyed him in a way, but he
Yeah.
also rose to the occasion. And the two greatest speeches of the modern American presidency were his two speeches back to back on June 10, 1963 and June 11, 1963. The first one was his peace speech, which is my favorite speech on foreign policy by any American president. And the June 11 speech was Kennedy's remarkable civil rights speech, which was half ad-libbed in front of the television cameras
Yeah.
because it was written so hastily. Sorensen was still giving him scrap text as the camera started up. Um, but the two speeches are each miraculous in their way. The first one said, we can make peace with the Soviet Union. They're humans too, and they
Right.
want peace too. That was the essence of the peace speech. And the June 11 speech said civil rights is a moral issue. And it's a moral issue as old as the scriptures and as clear as the US Constitution. And when he put it in such absolutely clear moral terms, which of you would be willing to change place with an African American in American society? Such simple, direct, clear terms. He shocked Martin Luther King Jr., actually, who was watching the speech and really couldn't believe his ears and eyes, what he was seeing, because Kennedy gave a profoundly deep and moving and eloquent speech on civil rights. So to me, those were the two defining issues of 1963.
Yeah. Um, and in the American University speech, he talks about a strategy for peace, right? Not just we're for peace, but we need a strategy to do it. It's not simple. It's going to take thinking through. To me, that seems like the whole idea that the president of the United States would have a strategy for peace. I mean, if somebody said it, you wouldn't believe it. You would say, "Well, they're just fake." They're not serious. But Kennedy was very serious. But that's something it seems like we've lost.
That speech is so more, I mean, I wrote a book about the speech. It's the only speech I ever wrote a book about.
Tell
Uh,
people what the book is so they can get it. What's your book
uh,
called?
the book is called To Move the World, JFK's Quest for Peace. And the phrase to move the world is a reference to Kennedy's remarks that he made after negotiating the test ban treaty when he spoke at the United Nations General Assembly to other world leaders for the last time in September 1963. And he quoted Archimedes, supposedly said Archimedes is said to have told his friends, "Give me a place to stand and I can move the world,"
Right,
explaining the lever. And
right.
Kennedy said, "Let us move the world towards peace." And I think that's what Kennedy was doing in 1963. And he resonated. And by the time he reached the UN General Assembly in September 1963, he was the world hero without question. He was beloved everywhere in the world. This is amazing. He was an American president beloved in the Soviet Union by then, in the communist countries by then, in the newly emerging independent countries by then. He was becoming the great statesman of the age, in
Yeah,
my opinion.
yeah.
And I don't know of another period of statesmanship like the period from October 1962 to November 1963 in all of American history, with perhaps the comparable periods of FDR at the beginning of the Depression, or FDR in 1940, 41,
Mhm.
or Abraham Lincoln in 1960, in 1861. Uh, this was a period of absolutely monumental leadership and statesmanship.
So, which brings us to November 22nd. Um, you say, I believe, the president was killed by enemies in his own government. How did you come to that realization? What made you think that, or
First, very gradually, because when I grew up, I was uh, 9 years old when Kennedy was shot.
uh
Uh, like everyone of a certain age at that time. Of course, I remember every detail and every moment, and being told at school and getting on the school bus and coming home to tell my parents only to find them with drawn shades and sobbing in our living room, um, and watching the television set Walter Cronkite for hours on end over the weekend, going off to my Sunday school class, and then being told that Lee Harvey Oswald was shot when I was picked up that morning. Everything, uh, everything about that. And being 10 years old, I remember the Warren Commission report, and it was the work of one lone gunman. And naturally, I believed it. And I think my parents believed it. And government told the truth, and they did an investigation, and, bad luck, but one lone loner who, ordered ordered a rifle, in the mail,
Uh-huh.
took out Kennedy senselessly. And Lyndon Johnson stood up and, you know, helped to stabilize the republic in our time of need.
Mhm.
And probably believed that for into my 20s or so, I would say, or 30s. Uh, my very brilliant late father-in-law said, Jeff, he was killed by, a coup. And I thought, uh, not really.
Yeah.
Um, so my starting point was not uh, that this was a conspiracy or a coup, but you grow up in life, and I have reached uh, through decades and decades of experience. I learned a lot. One of the things I learned along the way, of course, was the U.S. government lies nonstop, relentlessly.
Mhm.
It is an imperial power. It overthrows governments. It starts wars on false pretenses,
Mhm.
not mistaken pretenses, false pretenses. Uh, the CIA is a deep, dark, failed institution that has done more damage to our republic than any other institution in our history, in my view. And so these are things that I came to understand over time. I didn't study Kennedy or his administration or these issues uh, professionally until uh, this century, until the 2000s. And even then, my work was around international poverty alleviation and sustainable development, but I became more and more involved with the UN. And I became more and more involved with diplomacy. And I became more and more involved, therefore, with issues of war and peace, because after all, I started as a financial economist and worked on finances and then economic development and then diplomacy. And as I worked on diplomacy, I read Kennedy's peace speech, really for the first time, I think, or for the first time in any serious way. And I said, whoa, that is unbelievable. And in 2007, I think it was, I was invited to give the Wreath Lectures for BBC, which is a prestigious lecture series every year or two given around the world by a public intellectual. And I was honored to be asked to do that. And one of my five lectures was on Kennedy's peace speech. And who was sitting front and center in the audience? Ted Sorensen. And Ted said to me, the speechwriter, and Ted said to me afterwards, "You got it. You understood this."
Mhm.
And that was one of the most affirming, exciting moments of my life, to tell you the truth,
Yeah.
which is to have Ted Sorensen say, "You got my favorite speech. You understand it." So I started working on it. I started thinking about it even more and more and more. I finally wrote a book about it about a dozen years ago. Um, I was going to write something with Ted, and then Ted tragically passed away. But all of this led me to revisit uh, the assassination and also with, I'd say, an adult understanding of the US government after decades of work at a high level in international diplomacy and development. And one of the early things I did was read Mark Lane.
Uh-huh.
And I went back and I said, this guy's not crazy. This guy was a completely mainstream lawyer for the Democratic Party in New York, very professional, very qualified. And he fell into this because he saw all the anomalies of the Warren Commission. And there was nothing crazy about it at all.
No,
So
no,
I
and
read
and
another.
Yeah,
Yep.
and he's derided as a conspiracy theorist, but you go back and read Rush to Judgment, it's not a conspiracy theory. It's a
Not
defense.
at all. And then the upshot of it is everything points to a conspiracy. Everything points to uh, an inside job.
Mhm.
Uh, and everything points to the shoddiness, recklessness, awfulness of the Warren Commission.
Yeah. What was it about? I mean, such an extreme reaction to to kill a sitting president. What was the threat Kennedy posed? Why were people so threatened that they felt that was somehow appropriate?
I think the first thing it was a milieu of assassination, uh, even more than now. It was normal to kill political leaders. In the 50s and the 60s, the CIA was doing it normally. Uh, they thought nothing of killing Lumumba. They thought nothing of overthrowing governments. They planned in depth to kill Castro, even including, of course, the Kennedy administration itself. Um, I think it's pretty likely that Dag Hammarskjöld was killed, Secretary General. Was brought down in a plane. Exactly how and by whom is not known. But it was not unusual for a president of the United States to sit in the Situation Room or wherever and to say, eliminate that one. So there was lots of killing going on.
Yeah,
And the CIA was an assassination engine.
right.
So I think, you know, one shudders at the horror of this, but it was part of the times, actually,
Yeah,
all this killing.
yeah,
And so I think that's just part of the basic answer. And why? Well, Kennedy had lots of enemies. And, a coup can come together for a coalition of reasons, not necessarily one single reason. The anti-Castro factions hated him.
right.
The mafia hated him. The weirdos in the CIA, Alan Dulles, hated him.
Yeah, and then I always thought
All
you have deeply racist law enforcement structures in the Secret Service and the FBI who have absolutely no interest in investigating his death because of his civil rights stand. I always
Yeah,
I
yeah,
thought
they
that,
they exactly. I'm sure that's part of it. And by the way, Lyndon Johnson hated him. So it's uh, I'm one way or another, whether Johnson was a protagonist or simply brought along with it or whatever, all of his demeanor and comportment after the fact suggests to me not a guy worried about assassins on the loose and we got to track them down. He seemed absolutely rather calm
yeah,
that this thing was locked shut, and that was true within an hour or so.
yeah,
So this is not a man that felt, oh my God, what, and nor did J. Edgar Hoover feel we got to get to the bottom of this. He got to the bottom of it in half an hour.
yeah,
So, all of it points to the fact that there were a lot of people on the inside in the know
mhm,
whose reactions are just inexplicable
right.
if it weren't for the fact that, yeah, what do you think? We got him.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and I think the feeling was common. The country's in better hands now, so what's the problem? You know?
Yeah,
Like,
just a basic thing for me with Johnson is, your boss is killed uh, in supposedly, uh, an assassination from outside. you'd you'd wonder, well, are they out to get me next? Uh, you wouldn't close the investigation down You would order every law enforcement get to the bottom of this before they take out the rest of the government.
Right.
I don't see a scintilla of evidence that Lyndon Johnson had that reaction for one single moment.
Yeah.
And nor did our chief of law enforcement, J. Edgar Hoover, who somehow knew telepathically within minutes of the assassination that it was a lone gunman who's been apprehended.
Yeah. Um, was that the turning point? Was November 22nd the turning point between Republic and Empire in simplistic terms?
Yes, yes, I think after that, America in perpetual decline as a society and as a political system. We can see it in the opinion surveys, by the way. It's the end of U.S. confidence in the government,
Yeah.
and it's the decisive end. Of course, other things happened, Vietnam, Watergate, and so on. But if you look at the trend breaks on November 22nd, 1963. It is the end of American faith in government. And we suffer that today. Americans do not believe in our political system. I don't,
Yeah.
and I don't think most Americans do.
Yeah, and what a factor in lifting Trump's boat, this
Well, of
suspicion.
course. I mean, basically, and when it comes to Trump, by the way, I basically think Americans vote out the incumbents. They're just disgusted, one presidency after the next. And so I don't know whether Trump's vote in 2024 was really any mandate for anything specific for Trump, but it was sure a vote against a failed administration that was both a disaster and now we know a fraud,
Yeah.
and a fraud on the American people. By the way, I sensed that all along. You probably did also. I said for years that the president's demented, not being inside the room, but he gave every indication of it. And now we know, just more than we care to know about how phony the administration is. But this is also the American way of governance now. It's basically bullshit morning till night. That's true of any of these administrations. They just don't tell the truth about anything.
Yeah, the performance has taken over the completely. Um, um,
Managing the cycle, managing the narrative, this is what governance is now, or what it purports to be.
yeah. Well, on that depressing note, let's wrap it up. Uh, that was the key point I wanted to get at was, what does 1963 mean today? Why are we still talking about it? Why do I have JFK facts? Why did you write a book about Kennedy? How do we, tell people that something that happened 60 years ago? I mean, basically my entire lifetime almost. Why should that matter to somebody who's 25 today? You know?
I think you put it a different way, which is the way that I've concluded it.
Yeah.
If you, instead of saying Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963, if you say the United States had a coup led by the CIA in 1963, which changed our form of government forever, and we're suffering the consequences of that until today, it puts it in a different light. It's not the loss of not the tragic loss of a leader. It is the end of a system.
Hmm.
And I think that that is actually what happened. Uh, it's also important to remember when republics die, and the most famous death of a republic is the death of the Roman Republic, that became the Roman Empire, and sometimes dated to the rise of Augustus. The formal structures remain the same.
Hmm.
The Senate still was the Senate in Rome.
Hmm.
They didn't eliminate the Senate. The Senate went on for hundreds of years. same togas, same speeches, same titles, but they didn't mean anything anymore. Now there was an emperor, and the emperor ruled, and it became a military state, not a citizen state. Of course, it was always an elite citizen state, but it was a citizen state, and it became a military state. I think actually the one that probably put this best of anybody is Bob Dylan in Murder Most Foul. He basically writes. I don't have the words at my fingertip on my tongue, but he basically says it was the end of the American dream in a way, and the end of an era. And again, I think for a lot of my life, I viewed Kennedy's death as a tragedy and our loss of a great person at a great moment. But it really is much more than that. It was a loss of our system of government. And until today, we haven't recovered it. Until today, we are ruled by uh, secrecy, by a security apparatus, by a deep state that runs foreign policy to the point of bringing us to the brink of nuclear Armageddon.
Mhm.
And we don't have control over it, certainly not the public at all.
Yeah. Okay. We've talked for an hour. Let's leave it at that. Thank you, Jeffrey Sachs. Very enlightening. People should buy your book.
The book is To Move the World, JFK's Quest for Peace. And it is a good read because it's about the greatest speech on foreign policy by an American president and what could have been a turning point for the world.
Yeah. I urge everybody to buy it. Thank you, Jeffrey Sachs.
Bye-bye. Good to be with you. Appreciate it.
Hey, everybody. I wanted to call your attention to one surefire way to deepen your knowledge of the assassination of President Kennedy. And that's to read my 3 books about the CIA, a trilogy of spies that tells how the assassination actually unfolded in the eyes of CIA insiders. You see, my work on JFK's assassination is rooted not in the literature of conspiracy, but in the history of CIA operations. And that makes all the difference when it comes to understanding the events that culminated on November 22nd, 1963. You'll want to check out my 3 CIA books that tell the story of the founding generation of the Central Intelligence Agency and what 3 insiders actually thought about JFK's assassination. Meet charismatic Station Chief Winston Scott as he surveils Lee Harvey Oswald 6 weeks before Dallas. Meet urbane CIA Director Richard Helms as he fends off President Richard Nixon's attempts to blackmail him over JFK's assassination. Meet James Angleton, the ingenious, paranoid, and sinister counterintelligence chief who had controlled the agency's file on Oswald since 1959. In these books, you'll see the real historical foundation of the events that led to President Kennedy's assassination, and you'll understand this event in a much deeper way. Check out my books at jeffersonmorleybooks.com. You can buy all of these books there, as well as my other nonfiction book, Snowstorm in August. So check out the Trilogy of Spies.